They invited her to travel on Mother's Day. They made her tea, then left her alone at a deserted train station in the middle of a deserted field. No phone, no money, no one. And they left a handwritten note. If you are still awake, you will find your own way home. This is no accident. This was a trap planned in advance by her own son. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the most shocking stories, and comment with the name of the city or country you're watching. I want to know how far this story has traveled in the world. Now, let me tell you the whole truth. The morning Brendan called, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a single coffee mug. Just one. It had been one mug for 4 years now, ever since Raymond passed. One mug, one plate, one chair pulled up to the table. The house hadn't changed much since he died. I kept his reading glasses on the side table, kept his cardigan draped over the back of the armchair, kept the small routines that made the silence feel less permanent. I wasn't trying to preserve a shrine. I was just a woman who didn't know how to stop setting the table for two. So when the phone rang and I saw Brendan's name on the screen, my hands went still in the dishwater. He didn't call often. Twice in the past year, maybe 3 times. If you counted the voicemail he left on my birthday, that was clearly recorded while he was driving somewhere, distracted, his voice trailing off mid-sentence like he'd forgotten why he picked up the phone at all. I'd saved that voicemail. I'm not proud of it, but I had. Mom. His voice was warm, warmer than I expected. How are you? I'm fine, I said, the way I always said it, because telling the truth about how I was had never seemed to interest him much. I'm good, just doing some cleaning. Listen, I've been thinking. He paused, and I heard Kayla's voice somewhere in the background, low and indistinct. We want to do something special for Mother's Day this year, something different. I set the mug down on the dish rack. Different how? There's this train excursion, he said. It runs through the countryside and the old valley route past the ridge. You always loved trains, Mom. Remember when Dad used to take you on that anniversary trip every year? I did remember. Raymond had booked the same sleeper car on the Appalachian line every June without fail, right up until his knees got bad and the walk to the dining car became too much. I remembered the sound of the wheels on the track at night, the way the darkness outside the window made everything inside the car feel private and warm. That sounds lovely, I said, and I meant it, even though something in my chest felt cautious the way an animal feels cautious before a storm it can't yet smell. We'll pick you up at 10, Brendan said. Dress comfortable. Kayla's really looking forward to it. I almost asked him to repeat that last part. Kayla, looking forward to it. In 8 years of marriage to my son, Kayla had looked forward to very few things that involved me. She was not a cruel woman in the obvious way. She never raised her voice, never said anything openly vicious. But she had a talent for small exclusions, the kind that don't leave marks. Family dinners where the conversation shifted away from me whenever I spoke. Holiday visits that grew shorter each year, then stopped altogether. Birthday calls that Brendan made from the car so there was always background noise to fill the silences. But maybe things were changing. Maybe this was the beginning of something I'd been hoping for without letting myself say it out loud. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time. Then I went to the closet and pulled out Raymond's old wool scarf, the dark green one with the loose thread at one end that he'd never let me fix, and I draped it over the back of a chair where I could see it while I packed my bag. The morning of the trip was overcast but dry, the kind of May sky that can't quite decide what it wants to be. I was ready by 9:30. I had my canvas tote with a bottle of water, my journal, a granola bar, my reading glasses, and Raymond's scarf tucked inside like a talisman. I'm aware that's a strange thing to pack for a day trip, but the scarf smelled like him still, just barely, and I wasn't ready to stop needing that. Brendan's car pulled into my driveway at 10:05. I walked out before he could come to the door. That was something I'd learned to do over the years. Be ready, be quick, don't make them wait, and give them a reason to be impatient before we'd even started. Kayla was in the passenger seat. She turned and gave me a smile as I climbed into the back, the kind of smile you see in dentists' offices and parent-teacher conferences. Technically warm, personally distant. You look great, Evelyn, she said. Thank you, sweetheart. I buckled my seatbelt. You do too. Brendan glanced at me in the rearview mirror and smiled. A real one, I thought. Or maybe I just wanted it to be real. We drove for about 40 minutes. The conversation stayed surface level. The weather, a new restaurant they'd tried, something about a renovation project at their house. I asked questions. I tried. I told a story about my neighbor's dog that I thought was funny and got a polite laugh that died quickly. Kayla looked out the window. Brendan tapped the steering wheel. I watched the houses thin out and the fields open up and told myself it was fine. That it was enough just to be in the car with them. That not every conversation has to go deep. The station was small. That was the first thing I noticed. Smaller than I'd expected for a tourist excursion, smaller than the brochure Brendan had described. A single platform, weathered wood, a handwritten sign that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. There were a few benches, a rusted trash can, and no other passengers that I could see. "Is this the right place?" I asked. "The train runs a limited schedule," Kayla said smoothly. She was already getting out of the car. "Off-peak, that's why it's quiet." Brendan helped me out of the back seat, took my hand, squeezed it briefly, and we walked up to the platform together. The air smelled like cut grass and something older underneath it, something damp and abandoned. The station had clearly seen better decades. Paint peeled from the awning supports. The ticket window was shuttered with a padlock on it. I looked down the track in both directions and saw nothing. No train, no approaching headlight. "We might be a bit early," Brendan said, "or it's running a few minutes late." Kayla held up a small thermos. "I made tea, Evelyn. You always drink tea." I did. Earl Grey in the morning, chamomile in the afternoon. I'd mentioned it once at a family dinner, maybe 2 years ago. I hadn't realized she'd filed it away. "That's so thoughtful," I said, and I meant it. I was touched. Standing there on that quiet platform with the gray sky above us and the fields stretching out in every direction, I was genuinely touched. She poured a cup and handed it to me. I wrapped both hands around it the way I always do. My circulation isn't what it used to be, and the warmth felt good. We stood on the platform and waited. Brendan checked his phone a couple of times. Kayla asked me about my garden, whether I was still growing tomatoes, what I'd planted this spring. I told her about the new raised bed I'd put in along the back fence, about how Raymond had always insisted on heirloom varieties, and how I'd kept that going even though I sometimes ended up with more tomatoes than I could use and brought bags of them to the neighbors. She listened. She nodded. She said, "That's sweet." And somewhere in that conversation, I started to feel a little slow. Not sick, not wrong exactly, just slow. Like my thoughts were moving through something thicker than air. I finished the tea and held the empty cup and told myself it was just the overcast sky, the stillness of the morning, the unfamiliar quiet of a place that wasn't mine. "I need to use the restroom," I said. "There's one just down at the end of the platform," Kayla said, "around the corner on the left." I took my tote bag. Habit. The restroom was one of those old station outbuildings, concrete block, the kind that smells like rust and disinfectant. I splashed cold water on my face at the sink and looked at myself in the scratched metal mirror above the basin. My face looked back at me, older than I still expected it to be, because I still thought of myself as younger somehow, the way most people do. I dried my hands on a paper towel and breathed. When I came back to the platform, the car was gone. I stood there for a moment processing what I was seeing, what I wasn't seeing. No Brendan, no Kayla, no car in the gravel lot. I walked the full length of the platform, as if they might be on the other side of something, as if there were another side. There wasn't. There was the platform, the empty track, the fields, the road that curved away out of sight. I sat down on one of the benches. I told myself they'd gone to find parking somewhere, that Brendan had run to a gas station, that there was a rational explanation that would present itself in 5 minutes, 10 at most. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I opened my tote bag to get my phone and call him, and that was when I found the note. It was folded in half, plain white paper, slipped into the front pocket of my bag where my phone should have been. My phone wasn't there. I checked every compartment. My phone was gone. I unfolded the note. The handwriting was Kayla's. I recognized the particular neatness of it, the way she formed her letters like she was filling out a form. If she still has her mind, she'll find her way home. I read it twice. I read it a third time. And then I sat very still on that bench at that empty station while the sky above the fields shifted and a crow called somewhere in the distance, and I understood, with a terrible and clarifying slowness, exactly what was happening. This was not a forgotten Mother's Day trip. This was a test, or worse than a test, a demonstration, a performance designed to prove something that someone had already decided was true, that I was failing, slipping, no longer capable of managing my own life. And they needed evidence. They needed a story they could tell. We took her on a trip and she got confused and wandered away, and that's when we knew. The cruelty of it was specific, targeted. This wasn't a careless act. Someone had thought about what kind of woman I was, that I'd pack my own bag, that I'd go to the restroom alone without asking them to hold my things, that I'd take my tote with me out of habit. So they put the note inside it, where I'd find it only after I realized they were gone. Someone had thought about the tea. I pressed my hands flat on my thighs and felt them shaking. I am not a woman who cries easily. Raymond used to say I had a spine made out of something sturdier than bone. I'd buried my parents, buried my husband, outlived 2 close friends, and a marriage that almost broke before it didn't. Crying wasn't something I did in moments of crisis. Crying was something I did later, privately, when there was no one to see it and nothing left to manage. But sitting on that bench, I felt something behind my eyes that was close to it. Not grief, not even anger, not yet. Something rawer than both of those. The specific pain of being underestimated by the people who should have known better. My son. My son had planned this. I folded the note carefully and put it in my journal. Evidence was evidence. Then I stood up, checked my bag, water bottle still there, granola bar, journal, glasses, Raymond's scarf. And I looked down the road that led away from the station. I didn't know where I was exactly. Somewhere in the Valley counties, 40 minutes or so from my house, but I hadn't been paying close enough attention to the route to retrace it precisely. There was no town visible in any direction, no houses close enough to walk to easily, just fields and the road and the sky getting heavier above me. I was 72 years old, alone, without a phone, without money, without anyone who knew where I was. And I started walking. Sam. The road ran straight for a long time, then curved west through a stretch of old farmland. My knees have given me trouble since my early 60s. Not debilitating, but real. The kind of pain that requires you to pace yourself, to negotiate with your body instead of ignoring it. I walked slowly. I kept to the edge of the road. I tried to stay in the shade where there was any. I had been walking for what felt like 40 minutes when the truck slowed beside me. Old pickup, dark blue. One of those workhorse vehicles that looked like it had been maintained carefully through 30 years of actual use. The man behind the wheel was somewhere in his late 60s, stocky, with thick gray hair, and the kind of face that had spent significant time outdoors. He leaned out the window. "Ma'am, you need a ride somewhere?" In other circumstances, I might have hesitated, but I was standing on an empty road in the middle of nowhere with a shaking left knee and nowhere to hesitate to. "I need to get to Millhaven," I said. That was my town. "I'm not sure of the exact direction from here." He looked at me for a moment, not suspiciously, but carefully, the way people look when they're trying to decide if someone is all right. "Millhaven's about 18 miles east," he said. "Get in. I'll take you." His name was Harold Bennett. He told me that after a few minutes of driving, when I asked, because I felt I should know the name of the man I was trusting my life to. He'd been driving back from his brother's property. Retired now from 30 years of agricultural work, lived about 12 miles from where he'd found me, widower for 6 years. He didn't ask a lot of questions. I was grateful for that. He asked enough. Whether I was hurt, whether I needed water, whether there was someone I wanted him to call. And then he let the silence be what it was, which was a relief. "My son left me at a train station," I said eventually. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because the alternative was sitting in silence while my mind played the image of Kayla's handwriting on a loop. Harold was quiet for a moment. "That happened on purpose?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded, like that was a kind of information he knew what to do with. "Then I'm glad I came by when I did." That was all he said. No pity, no horror, no flood of reassurances that I'm sure he's a good boy, that there must be an explanation. Just, "I'm glad I came by when I did." I sat back in the seat and watched the fields roll past, and felt something in my chest go quiet enough to think. Harold pulled into my driveway at 2:30 in the afternoon. My street looked the same as it always did. Ordinary, familiar, the rose bush by the mailbox that I kept meaning to trim back and never quite got to. But the house felt different before I was even through the door. The front step was the first thing. A faint scrape mark in the paint beside the lock. New, I was almost certain. My door locks with a deadbolt and a handle lock, and I have used both of them every day for 11 years. I know every scratch on that hardware. Inside, I stood in the entryway and looked. Nothing obvious. Nothing visibly moved or disrupted. But I've lived in that house for 31 years, and I know it the way you know your own body. By feel, by the small wrongness that sounds no alarm but registers anyway. The stack of mail on the kitchen counter. I keep it sorted. Bills on the left, everything else on the right. It was reversed. The filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. I keep it locked. The key lives on a small hook inside the closet door. The key was still on the hook. The cabinet was still locked. But there was a faint indentation in the carpet in front of it, like someone had stood there, weight shifting. And the document on top of the cabinet, Raymond's old tax folder that I use as a kind of placeholder for current financial papers, had been moved. I was sure of it. A foot to the left, turned slightly. I sat down at the kitchen table. Harold was still outside. He'd offered to wait until I was settled, and I'd told him he could come in if he wanted. He came in and stood near the door, giving me space, reading the room without me having to explain it. "Someone's been here," I said. "Yeah," he said. "Looks like it." I opened the filing cabinet with my key. The papers were there, the will, the bank documents, the property deed, all of it present. But I found something that hadn't been there before. A single-page form tucked between the bank statements, half filled out in a handwriting I recognized. It wasn't complete, but I could read enough. An authorization form for financial account access, with Kayla's name typed neatly into the beneficiary line. I set it down on the table and looked at it for a long time. My hands had stopped shaking by then. That was the strange part. The more concrete the evidence became, the stiller I felt. Like my body understood that panic was no longer the appropriate response, that something else was required now. I picked up my journal. I opened it to a fresh page. I began writing down everything I remembered, in order, with times where I could estimate them. The phone call, the drive, the station, the tea, the note, the walk, Harold, the house, the document. Every detail while it was still fresh. I wrote for a long time. Harold sat across from me and didn't rush me. When I finally set the pen down, I looked at him. He was a stranger, a man I had known for less than 3 hours. And he was sitting at my kitchen table with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes a situation requires you to stay. "I think they're planning to have me declared incompetent," I said. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. It sounded both outrageous and completely plausible. I think today was supposed to be the beginning of that. Harold looked at me with those steady, outdoor-weathered eyes. "Then they picked the wrong woman," he said. I almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because something in those words, the plain, quiet certainty of them, landed somewhere I needed them to land. I picked up my pen again. I was 72 years old, and I had just been abandoned at a train station and returned home to find my own house entered and my financial documents tampered with by my son and his wife. I was not confused. I was not losing my mind. I was not helpless. I was angry, and I had just started taking notes. I wrote for 2 hours that night, not the kind of writing I used to do in my journal, the soft, reflective kind, where I'd describe the light through the kitchen window or note something Raymond had said that made me laugh. This was different. This was documentation. Names, times, exact words where I could remember them, approximate words where I couldn't. The phone call from Brendan 3 days ago, the invitation, the way his voice had sounded warmer than usual, warm enough that I'd noticed it, warm enough that I'd saved it like a gift. The drive to the station, Kayla handing me the tea with both hands, the way you hand something to someone you want to appear kind to, the platform, the benches, the shuttered ticket window, the crow somewhere in the fields. I wrote it all down. Harold stayed until I asked him to go, which wasn't until almost 6 in the evening. He wasn't intrusive about it. He sat at my kitchen table and drank the coffee I made. I needed to do something with my hands. and he read the newspaper I had on the counter, an old one from 2 days ago, and he didn't fill the silence with noise. When I finally looked up from my journal and said, "I think I'm all right for tonight," he nodded, like that was the answer he'd been waiting for, and stood up without any ceremony. "I'm going to write my number on this," he said, picking up the corner of the newspaper and tearing a small strip. He wrote it in pencil, slow and deliberate, the way a person writes when they mean it. "You call if you need anything, doesn't matter what time." "I don't want to impose," I said, which was reflex more than honesty. He gave me a look, not unkind, but direct. "You walked 18 miles of road alone today because your family abandoned you. You're not going to impose on me by calling." I took the number. After he left, I locked both locks on the front door and stood in my entryway for a long moment. The house was quiet, in the way it was always quiet, but the quality of it felt different now. There was a layer underneath the familiar silence that hadn't been there before. The knowledge that someone had stood inside these walls without my permission, had moved through my rooms, had touched my papers. That knowledge changes a space in a way that's hard to explain and impossible to unfeel. I went room to room, not frantically. I was deliberate about it, methodical. I looked at every surface I cared about, every drawer I kept important things in, every corner of every closet. I wasn't sure what I was looking for beyond confirmation of what I already suspected, but I needed to know the full shape of what had been done. In the spare bedroom, behind the filing cabinet, I found a small scratch in the baseboard that looked recent, the kind of mark made by something being dragged across painted wood. The filing cabinet had been moved and returned, but not quite to the same place. The indentation in the carpet told me that. In the kitchen, the second drawer, the one with the household documents, the utility records, the insurance cards, had been gone through. I could tell because I keep things in a specific order that other people would call chaotic, but that makes perfect sense to me, and the order had been disturbed by hands that didn't know my system. In my bedroom, nothing obvious. But my jewelry box, the small lacquered one Raymond brought back from a work trip decades ago, was positioned at a slightly different angle on the dresser. Whoever had been through the house wasn't a professional burglar. They hadn't taken anything. They weren't here for valuables. They were here for information, for access, for the laying of groundwork. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to think clearly about what I knew. Brendan and Kayla had taken me to a remote station and left me there without a phone, without money, with a note designed to frame the situation as a test of my mental competence. While I was gone, while they knew I would be gone, for as long as it took me to find my way back, which they may have assumed would take much longer than it did, someone had entered my home and been through my documents. The half-completed form with Kayla's name on it had been left behind. Whether by accident or by design, I wasn't sure. Maybe they'd been interrupted. Maybe they'd left it intentionally, a kind of placeholder, a draft of the future they were building without my knowledge or consent. The picture that assembled itself in my mind was not a complicated one. They wanted control of my finances. To get that legally, they needed a mechanism. And the most reliable mechanism available to them was a finding of incapacity. If they could demonstrate, with documentation and witnesses, that I was no longer able to manage my own affairs, they could petition for guardianship. And with guardianship came control of everything: my accounts, my property, my decisions. The abandoned train station hadn't been cruelty for cruelty's sake. It had been set up. It was supposed to generate a story. We took Mom on a simple outing and she got disoriented and wandered off. We were terrified. We searched for hours. A story they could tell to a doctor, to a lawyer, to a judge. A story that began, as all such stories do, with a small and seemingly credible incident. If Harold hadn't come by when he did, if I had been forced to sit at that station until dark, or to knock on farmhouse doors in an unfamiliar county, or to be found confused and exhausted by someone Brendan had arranged to find me, the story would have written itself exactly the way they wanted it. I sat with all of this for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen, made myself a bowl of soup I didn't particularly taste, and went to bed. I didn't sleep much, but I lay still in the dark and I thought, and thinking was something I had always been good at when I gave myself the space to do it. In the morning, I called Martha Collins. Martha and I had known each other for almost 30 years. We'd met at a neighborhood association meeting when we were both young enough that 30 years seemed like an abstraction rather than a weight. She'd been a family law attorney for most of her career, retired now but sharp, in the way that some people stay sharp regardless of what they stop doing professionally. She had seen things in her years of practice that had given her a particular and unsentimental view of how families can turn against each other. She was not a woman who was easily surprised. She picked up on the second ring. Evelyn. Her voice was the same as it had always been, measured, warm, but not soft. It's early. What happened? I need to talk to you, I said. Something happened yesterday that I need a legal mind on. A pause. How serious? Serious enough that I'm calling you at 7:30 in the morning. Come over at 9, she said. I'll put on the good coffee. Martha lived about a mile and a half from me in a stone colonial she'd shared with her husband Carl until he passed 4 years ago. She answered the door in reading glasses and a cardigan, and she looked at my face the way people who have known you a long time look when they understand something is wrong before you've said a word. Sit down, she said. Tell me. I told her everything. I told it in the same order I'd written it in my journal, linear, factual, with as much detail as I could hold. And I handed her the note and the authorization form in a plastic sleeve I'd put them in the night before. She read both of them without speaking. She set them down on the coffee table between us. The form isn't completed, she said. No, I think they were interrupted, or it was left intentionally as a marker. Either way, it was inside my locked filing cabinet. And the tea. She said it carefully, like she was placing a word on a scale. You felt slowed down after drinking it. I felt slower than normal, yes. I don't know what was in it. I can't prove anything about the tea. I'm only telling you what I experienced. Martha took her glasses off and held them by one arm, the way she did when she was thinking hard. Evelyn, what you're describing, if it's what it appears to be, is a coordinated attempt to establish grounds for an involuntary guardianship petition. That's what I concluded. The station incident would be documented as evidence of cognitive decline. The home entry was preparation. They were likely assessing your documents to understand what they'd be dealing with and to begin positioning access. The authorization form suggests they were moving faster than they probably should, which means either they're impatient or they have a timeline. A timeline for what? She looked at me steadily. For filing. If they've already been in conversation with an attorney, there may be steps already in motion. A guardianship petition doesn't happen overnight, but the groundwork can be laid quickly if someone knows what they're doing. The word petition sat in the air between us like something with weight. I thought about Brendan's face in the rear-view mirror, smiling at me. I thought about Kayla handing me the tea. What do I do? I asked. Martha leaned forward and put her glasses back on. First, she said, you don't confront them. Not yet. Not until you have everything protected. She picked up the plastic sleeve. I'm going to recommend someone who specializes in elder law. You need your documents reviewed and amended where necessary, particularly your power of attorney and your beneficiary designations, because if Kayla's name is already appearing on forms in your files, there may be other places they've tried to insert access that you haven't found yet. The thought of that made my stomach turn. You think there's more? I think you should assume there's more until you've verified there isn't. She reached across and touched my hand briefly. You found the one they left behind. That doesn't mean it's the only one. I drove home with my jaw tight and my hands careful on the wheel. It took me 3 days to find the second form. I went through every document in that house with the focus of someone who has something worth protecting and has only recently understood that protection isn't automatic. I went through the filing cabinet twice. I went through the kitchen drawers. I went through the shoebox in my bedroom closet where I kept older financial correspondence. I went through the folder of utility bills on the shelf by the telephone. The second form was tucked into the back of my homeowner's insurance folder. Another authorization document, this one for property management access, with Kayla's name printed on it in the same neat hand. More complete than the first. Dated 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. While I'd been going about my life, watering my tomatoes, watching the evening news, eating dinner alone at my kitchen table, they had been in my house. Not just on Mother's Day. Before that. This had been going on before that. I sat down on the floor of my spare bedroom with that form in my hands, and I let myself feel the full scope of it. This wasn't a sudden impulse. This wasn't a plan hatched in a moment of frustration. This was something that had been building, something deliberate and patient and constructed over time, brick by careful brick. while I was kept far enough away that I couldn't see the shape of what was being built. My son had been planning this for at least 2 weeks that I could document, possibly longer. I called Martha that evening. She told me to bring the second form when I came in to meet with her colleague, an elder law attorney named Douglas Farr, the following Tuesday. She told me not to discuss this with anyone else yet. She told me not to change my behavior toward Brendan and Kayla in any way that would signal to them that I knew. That last part was the hardest, because Brendan called me 2 days later. My phone rang on a Thursday evening, just after 7. I was in the kitchen. I'd been going through Raymond's old contacts book, looking for names of people I might need to reach in the coming weeks. People from his professional life who had become my people too. People who might be called upon to speak to my character and my competence if it ever came to that. I picked up the phone before I let myself think too carefully about it. "Mom." Brendan's voice, careful now. Not warm the way it had been before the trip, not cold either. Positioned somewhere in the middle, the vocal equivalent of someone keeping their hands visible. "I wanted to check on you." I made myself breathe normally. "I'm fine," I said. "We got a little worried after the other day." A pause. "The trip didn't go the way we planned, and I know that was upsetting." I had a choice in this moment. I could hear it clearly. The fork in the path, one direction leading to confrontation and the other to patience. Everything in me wanted the confrontation, wanted to say, "You left me at an empty train station and came home and went through my filing cabinet." I know. I have the note in a plastic sleeve. I have both forms. I have Harold's name and the timeline written in my journal, and I am one phone call away from making your life significantly more complicated than you planned for. I said none of it. "These things happen," I said instead. "I got home all right, don't worry." Another pause, longer this time. I could feel him recalibrating. "How did you get home?" he asked. And there it was. That was the question he'd been working towards since he dialed my number. Not how was I doing, not was I okay. How did I get home? Because they had expected a different answer to that question. They had expected something that served their narrative. Confusion, distress, a wandering woman who couldn't find her way. Whatever I said now would tell them whether their plan had worked or failed. "A neighbor gave me a lift," I said. "Which neighbor?" I smiled, which he couldn't see. "An old friend of Raymond's, actually. I hadn't seen him in years. It was a nice surprise." That was not entirely true, but it was true enough that I didn't feel guilty about it. Harold was an old man from Raymond's general era of the world, and he had become something like a friend in the space of an afternoon. "Close enough." Brendan was quiet. "Well," he said finally. "Good. I'm glad you're okay. Thank you for checking on me. We should get together soon, talk properly." "Absolutely," I said. "You know where I live." We hung up. I set the phone down on the counter and stood very still for a moment, listening to my own heartbeat. He'd been checking to see if the plan had worked, and now he knew it hadn't, though he didn't know why, and he didn't know what I knew, and that gap, the space between what he assumed I understood and what I actually understood, was the only advantage I had. I needed to keep it. I needed to move inside it, carefully and quickly, before he thought to close it. Tuesday came. Douglas Farr's office was in a building downtown, a small, deliberately unassuming space that felt like it had been designed to make frightened elderly clients feel less frightened. It mostly worked. He was a compact man in his early 50s, brisk in a way that felt competent rather than cold, with a habit of writing things down by hand even though there was a laptop open in front of him. Martha sat beside me. I laid everything on the table. The note from the station, still in its sleeve. Both authorization forms. My journal, open to the pages I'd written that night and the days following. A timeline I'd typed up at home and printed because my handwriting gets harder for other people to read. When I'm tired, and I had been tired. Farr read through everything without speaking. He made notes. He asked a few questions, direct ones, about dates and locations, and exactly what documents had been in which folders. He asked about the tea, whether I'd experienced anything like that before, whether I had any history of sensitivity to medications. I told him no on both counts. When he was done reading, he leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Hart, I'm going to tell you what I think is happening here, and then I'm going to tell you what we're going to do about it." He said it matter-of-factly, the way a doctor tells you a diagnosis they've made before, and know how to treat. What you're describing is a pattern consistent with a coordinated attempt to manufacture evidence of cognitive incapacity for the purpose of pursuing guardianship. The station incident was designed to create a documented event. The home entry and the forms were preparatory. They were building the infrastructure for financial control before any legal process was even initiated. "How far along do you think they are?" Martha asked. "Without knowing whether they've already retained an attorney, hard to say. But the authorization forms suggest they were moving toward accessing accounts directly, which means they may have intended to act financially before or alongside a legal petition. Both avenues need to be closed." He walked me through what needed to happen. First, a comprehensive review and update of all my legal documents. My power of attorney, currently held in a version I'd signed 12 years ago, needed to be revoked and redrawn with explicit protections and a named trusted individual who was not Brendan or Kayla. My will needed review. My bank accounts needed new security protocols. A direct conversation with my branch manager, someone I knew personally, flagging potential unauthorized access attempts. Second, my medical records. If they were building a case around cognitive decline, they would need medical documentation to support it. FAR recommended I schedule an appointment with my primary care physician specifically for a cognitive assessment, not because I had any doubt about my own mind, but because having a current dated evaluation from my own doctor was exactly the kind of evidence that dismantled a narrative of incapacity before it could take root. Third, the recordings. "Going forward," FAR said, looking at me carefully, "any communication you have with your son or daughter-in-law should be documented. In this state, single-party consent applies to recorded conversations, which means you can legally record any call or in-person conversation you are part of without informing the other party." I looked at him. "You're telling me to record my own son. I'm telling you that if they are building a case against your competency, you need to be building a case for your defense at the same time. Yes, record everything." I drove home from that meeting feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, not grief, but a kind of grim and purposeful clarity. The situation was bad. It was genuinely, measurably bad. My son and his wife had done something I would not have believed them capable of 6 months ago, and the evidence in my possession suggested they were prepared to go further. But bad situations are not the same as hopeless ones, and I had spent my whole life learning the difference. I had Martha. I had Douglas Farr. I had Harold's number on a scrap of newspaper. I had my journal. And I had something else, something they hadn't accounted for when they planned a test designed to reveal a woman coming apart. They had given me a reason to pay attention. Harold came by that Friday. He called first. I'd given him my number before he left that first evening, and asked if I needed anything from the hardware store because he was going anyway. It was such an ordinary thing to ask, so entirely without drama, that I stood at the kitchen counter holding the phone and felt my throat get tight for reasons I couldn't entirely justify. "I could use a new deadbolt," I said. "The front door. Something heavier than what I have." He came by at noon with 2 deadbolts and a bag from the deli 2 blocks from his house. We sat at my kitchen table and ate sandwiches while he told me about his brother's property, the fence he'd been helping repair, the way the valley looked in early May when the fields went from brown to green almost overnight. He talked about the land the way Raymond used to talk about his woodworking, with the particular affection of someone who has found a thing that gives them peace. I told him what I'd learned from the attorney. Not all of it, just the shape of it, the general outline of where things stood. He listened in the way he'd listened before, completely, without interrupting, without trying to manage or minimize what I was telling him. "They don't know what you know yet," he said, when I finished. "No." "How long do you think before they try something else?" "Not long." I looked at the grain of the kitchen table. "Brendan's always been impatient. He gets it from his father, except Raymond's impatience was directed at projects, at things that needed to get done. Brendan's has always been directed at people." I paused. He was a difficult teenager, not in the obvious ways, that never drugs, never in trouble at school, but he had a way of deciding what he needed from a situation and then moving to get it with very little regard for anyone who was in the way. I used to tell myself it was drive, that it would serve him well as an adult. I looked up. "It does serve him well, just not in ways I'm always comfortable with." Harold was quiet for a moment. "You feel guilty," he said. Not a question. Some, I admitted, the way you feel guilty about anything you feel you should have seen coming. That's not the same as being responsible for it. No, I said, but it takes a while to untangle. He installed the deadbolt after lunch, so new hardware, more substantial than what had been there, the kind that would require real effort to compromise. He tested it 3 times before he was satisfied. There was something reassuring in that thoroughness, in watching someone who did physical work treat a small task as though it deserved the same care as a large one. When he left that afternoon, I stood on the porch and watched his truck pull away and thought about the strange arithmetic of loss and replacement. Not replacement exactly, because nothing and no one replaces anyone, but the way life keeps offering you people even when you've told yourself the catalog is closed. Raymond had been gone 4 years. Brendan had been gone longer than that, in the ways that mattered. And here was Harold Bennett, a stranger who'd stopped on a rural road because a woman was walking alone, and who kept showing up not because he had to, but because he had decided to. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table with my journal and my recorder, a small digital one I'd bought at the electronics store the day before, compact enough to fit in a cardigan pocket, and I looked at both of them. My son thought I was a woman losing her grip on things. He thought the evidence of that was accumulating in his favor. He thought the next move was his. I opened the journal to a fresh page. He was going to find out how wrong he was about all 3. The recorder fit perfectly in my right cardigan pocket. I tested it twice, pressed record, spoke a few words, played it back. The sound quality was clear. My voice was steady. My handwriting on the page in front of me was the same it had always been, firm, a little angular, the particular script of a woman who learned to write when teachers still cared about penmanship. Outside, a late afternoon wind moved through the rose bush by the mailbox, the one I kept meaning to trim and never did. I had a meeting to request, a family dinner to arrange, a conversation to have with my son, except this time I would be the one deciding what was really happening in that room. I wrote the date at the top of the page. Then I started to plan. The dinner was my idea. That was the part they never saw coming, that the invitation would come from me. I called Brendan on a Sunday morning, 10 days after the train station, 10 days after I'd sat on that bench and read Kayla's handwriting on a folded piece of paper and understood that the life I thought I was living had a false floor under it. 10 days of documentation, of meetings with Douglas Farr, of new locks and new legal language, and a digital recorder that I had already filled twice over with the ambient sounds of my own house, while I practiced keeping my voice level in conversations I rehearsed alone in my kitchen. 10 days of becoming someone they hadn't planned for. "I'd like to have you both over for dinner," I told Brendan. "Next Saturday. I've been thinking about how the Mother's Day trip didn't quite work out, and I don't want that to be the last thing between us. I want to cook a real meal and sit at the table, like a family." There was a pause on his end. I counted it, 4 seconds, maybe 5. Long enough to be calculation. "That sounds really nice, Mom," he said. "I'll check with Kayla." "Tell her I'm making the pot roast," I said. "She mentioned once that she liked it." She had never mentioned that. But I said it the way you say something true, and I let him carry it back to her. He called me 2 hours later to confirm. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table and let myself feel the full strangeness of what I was doing. I was inviting my son and his wife to dinner so that I could record what they said, so that I could watch them perform concern for a woman they believed was deteriorating, and document that performance for a legal file that was growing thicker by the week in Douglas Farr's office. I was setting a table and planning a menu and buying good wine and doing all of the ordinary domestic things that a mother does when her family comes over. And underneath all of it, I was building a case. Raymond would have had feelings about that. Complicated ones. He had believed, with a stubbornness that was sometimes its own problem, that family was worth fighting for and that people were capable of better than their worst moments. He had also been a practical man who understood that love without accountability was just permission. I think he would have told me to do what I was doing. I think he also would have hated that I had to. I called Martha that afternoon and told her about the dinner plan. "That's either brilliant or dangerous," she said, with the directness I had loved about her for 30 years. "Why dangerous?" "Because if they suspect you know more than you're showing, they might use it as an opportunity to escalate. Being in your home, on your territory. They might try to push something forward. Have a conversation about your health, about your future. About what kind of support you need. It could be a fishing expedition. Good, I said. Let them fish. I have better equipment. Martha was quiet for a moment. You've changed in the last 10 days. People change when the situation requires it. No, she said carefully. Some people freeze, some people fall apart, some people convince themselves it's not as bad as it is and wait for it to get worse. You went the other direction. Another pause. I just want to make sure you're all right inside all this strategy. I looked out my kitchen window at the back garden, at the raised bed along the fence where the tomato plants were coming in slow and steady, staked with the same wooden dowels Raymond had bought from the hardware store years ago, and that I kept using because I still had them. I'm angry, I said. I'm angrier than I've been in a long time, but I'm not all right in the way you mean no. I'm holding it together because that's what the situation needs. I'll fall apart later when I can afford to. That's honest, Martha said. It's the best I've got right now. She told me to call her immediately after the dinner. She told me to make sure the recorder was charged and that I'd tested it that morning. She told me to eat something before they arrived, so I wasn't managing food and managing them at the same time. I wrote all of it down because writing things down had become, in the past 10 days, the primary way I kept myself anchored. Saturday came in warm and overcast, the kind of late May day that can't commit to summer. I spent the morning cooking. The pot roast went in at 10, low and slow the way Raymond had always insisted, with carrots and onion and a cup of red wine that I measured out and then stood there looking at the bottle and decided to pour myself a small glass of 2, because I had earned it. The recorder was in my cardigan pocket by noon, charged, tested, running. I had spent 2 evenings that week going through every inch of my house again, not looking for documents this time, but for anything they might try to use against me in the room. A medication I'd never taken that appeared in my cabinet, a note in my own handwriting that could be misread, anything that could be framed as evidence of confusion or decline. I found nothing, which reassured me without completely settling me, because I had learned in the past 10 days that the absence of evidence isn't the same as the absence of planning. I had also done something Martha and Douglas Farr didn't know about yet. 3 days earlier, I had gone to my bank, Millhaven Savings, where I had held accounts for over 20 years, where the branch manager was a woman named Patricia Steele, who had processed Raymond's estate and who knew me well enough to ask about my garden when I came in. I had sat across from Patricia's desk and told her, as plainly as I could, what was happening. I told her about the authorization forms with Kayla's name. I told her about the pattern I'd identified. I told her that I had reason to believe someone might attempt to access my accounts using documents I had not legally authorized, and that I needed her to flag my accounts for manual review on any access request, and to call my personal cell phone to verify before processing anything. Patricia had listened with the still, careful attention of someone who has seen more than she's supposed to talk about in a professional context. "Evelyn," she said when I finished, "this isn't the first time I've heard something like this. I didn't think it would be. I want you to know that what you're describing, the forms, the name insertions, if they come in here with paperwork, we have protocols, especially for accounts with long-standing established patterns. Unusual access requests go through verification." She paused. "But I'm glad you told me directly. That matters." She made notes on her side. She updated my account flags herself while I was sitting there and showed me what she'd entered so I could see it. I drove home from the bank feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, like the ground under me had some solidity to it again. Not safety. I wasn't naive enough to feel safe, but something structural, something that held. Brendan and Kayla arrived at 6:15, 15 minutes late, which was typical for Kayla, who had a consistent habit of being just late enough to establish that her time had a different value than other people's. Brendan was wearing a shirt I hadn't seen before, which meant Kayla had dressed him, which meant this evening had been deliberated over on their end too. Kayla carried a bottle of wine and handed it to me at the door with both hands, the same gesture she'd used with the tea, and I registered that without letting it show on my face. "You look wonderful, Evelyn," she said. She had a gift for the compliment that managed to contain a question. "You look wonderful, more wonderful than we expected under the circumstances." "Come in," I said. "Everything's almost ready." The house was warm from the oven and smelled like the dinner I'd been cooking all day, and for a moment, just a moment, I could imagine this being an ordinary evening, a family meal. A mother and son and his wife sitting around a table. I had spent years wanting exactly this, and the fact that I was standing inside it now while a recorder ran in my cardigan pocket was a grief I didn't have room to feel in full. I felt it around the edges. That was enough. Brendan hugged me at the door, a real hug, longer than he'd given me in years, and I let myself have it because whatever was happening between us, he was still my son, and his arms still felt the way they had when he was 12 years old and too tall to fit neatly against me anymore. Some things live in the body independent of everything else. Smells incredible, he said. Your grandmother's recipe, I said. The long version. I don't make it often anymore. Takes most of the day. But it felt like the occasion warranted it. Something moved across his face too quickly for me to read. Then he smiled. We had drinks in the living room first. I had set out glasses and a pitcher of sparkling water alongside the wine, and I poured myself water, citing the medication adjustment my doctor had mentioned at a recent appointment, which was true. My blood pressure prescription had been tweaked in March, and noted that Brendan filed that information away. I could see him do it, the small internal registration of something health-related. Noted. Kayla asked about my garden. I told her about the tomatoes, about the new raised bed, about the roses by the mailbox that I kept meaning to trim. I talked about ordinary things with the fluency of someone who has been talking about ordinary things her whole life. And I watched Kayla's face for what lived underneath her attentiveness. What I saw there was patience, a particular calculating patience. She was waiting for something, an opening, a slip, a moment where the conversation could be steered somewhere more useful. She held her wine glass with 2 fingers, and she smiled and she asked questions, and she waited. Brendan was telling me, she said, after the conversation had moved through the garden and the neighborhood and a new restaurant that had opened downtown, that you've been thinking about your future plans, your living situation, your finances, all of that. I looked at her. Was he? Brendan shifted slightly. I just mentioned that we've been thinking about it. All of us getting older, Mom. Making sure you have what you need. That's thoughtful, I said. We were wondering if you'd given any thought to financial management, whether you'd want some help with that. With the accounts, the property, it's a lot to manage alone. I let a silence develop, not a long one, just enough to be a silence. I have a financial advisor, I said. I've had the same one for 9 years. He manages everything very capably. Of course, Kayla said smoothly. But in terms of day-to-day access, if something were to happen, if you needed someone to step in quickly, I have legal documents that address that, I said. Updated recently, in fact. Everything's in order. Another beat. Kayla smiled. Recently? Earlier this month. I smiled back, the same register of smile, warm and entirely opaque. I'd been meaning to update them for a while. You know how those things go, you put them off, and then something reminds you to get around to it. The air in the room changed in a way that I felt more than saw. Brendan put his glass down on the side table. Kayla's eyes moved to him in a way, quick as a pulse. They hadn't expected that. Updated documents changed their calculus in ways they would need to privately reckon with, and they couldn't ask me about it here, not directly, without revealing they had a reason to ask. Let's eat, I said. Everything will get cold. Dinner was its own performance, and we all gave it our best. I had set the table properly, the cloth I kept for occasions, the good china that Raymond and I had been given as a wedding gift, and that I used maybe 3 times a year because I refused to let it become purely decorative. Candles. The pot roast plated with the carrots and the pan gravy that I'd spent 20 minutes getting right because I am still, after everything, a woman who cares about the quality of the food she serves. Brendan ate with the focused appreciation of someone who genuinely liked food. That had always been true of him, from childhood, the way certain physical pleasures bypassed whatever defenses he carried and reached him directly. He had 2 portions. He said, "This is incredible, Mom," in a tone of voice that was entirely unguarded, and I believed him, and I held that alongside everything else I was holding, because people are not simple, and the man across the table from me was capable simultaneously of this and of what he had done at the train station, and both of those things were true. Kayla ate neatly and said the right things and watched. The conversation during dinner ranged carefully. They told me about a trip they were considering, somewhere out west, a national park, hiking. I asked questions. I was interested because I had always been genuinely interested in the world, And that didn't stop being true just because I was recording the conversation in my pocket. Then Brendan said, "We've been talking to someone, a family advisor, someone who specializes in planning for aging parents." I set my fork down. "Is that right?" I said. We're not trying to overstep," he said, and the stumble in his delivery was the most honest thing he'd said all evening. "It's just that after the Mother's Day trip when you got separated," he said. He looked at me. "You were upset. You were lost. We didn't know where you were for hours, and it scared us." I thought about the note in Kayla's handwriting. I thought about both authorization forms in Douglas Farr's file folder. I thought about the scratch on my baseboard and the reversed mail on my counter, and Patricia Steele's hands on her keyboard, flagging my accounts. "I was upset," I said, "and I found my way home, which is what the note suggested I should do if I still had my mind." The silence that followed that sentence had a different texture than the previous ones. Kayla was very still. Brendan said, "What note?" "The one that was left in my bag at the station." I said it quietly, without heat, without the confrontational edge I had been rehearsing against for 10 days and had decided not to use tonight. Not yet. Not here. The note that said, "If she still has her mind, she'll find her way home." I found it when I looked for my phone, which was also not in my bag. The color that left Brendan's face did not come back. Kayla said nothing. She had gone somewhere behind her eyes. "I want you both to understand something," I said. I was still using my dinner voice, measured, unhurried, the voice of a woman who has lived long enough to know that the most devastating things can be said in a register just above quiet. "I understand that you're concerned about me. I understand that watching a parent age is frightening, and that sometimes that fear turns into something that doesn't look like love anymore, even when it started there. I understand all of that, and I am not without compassion for it." Brendan's jaw was tight. I was not a man who handled being surprised well, and he was deeply surprised right now, and the surprise was sitting badly on him. "But I also want you to understand," I continued, "that I am not confused. I am not deteriorating. I am not a woman who needs to be managed or tested or have her independence quietly removed from her. I have lived in this world for 72 years. I have buried people I loved. I have kept this house and these finances and this life in good order for 4 years completely alone, and I intend to continue doing so. Mom, I'm not finished." I said it gently, firmly, the way you say something when you mean it absolutely. "If there are concerns about my well-being, I welcome the conversation, openly, directly, not through forms left in my filing cabinet, and not through trips designed to leave me stranded somewhere so that someone can document what happens when I'm frightened and alone." Kayla put her napkin on the table. "Evelyn," she started. "I have a very good attorney," I said. "I have a doctor's evaluation scheduled for next week that I have requested myself proactively because I have nothing to hide about the state of my mind. I have recently updated all of my legal documents, and I have, over the past several weeks, kept very thorough records." I looked at her. "I am telling you this not as a threat. I am telling you this as information, because I believe you deserve to know where things stand before you take another step in a direction that none of us will be able to come back from." The candles on the table had burned down about an inch. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. Brendan said very quietly, "Who have you been talking to?" "My attorney," I said. "My doctor. Old friends." I picked my fork back up. "People who care about me." He sat back in his chair like something had gone out of him. Kayla was looking at the candle, not at me. Her face was composed in that particular practiced way that I now recognized as not composure at all, but the habit of composure, the performance of it, maintained through effort. Her hands were in her lap, and I could see from the faint tension in her shoulders that they were not relaxed there. I ate a bite of pot roast. It was, in fact, very good. The long cook had done what long cooking always does, broken everything down into something tender, and I was glad I had made it properly because I had needed the hours of preparation. I had needed to do something careful and slow with my hands. "I'd like us to have a different kind of relationship," I said, when the silence had lasted long enough. "I would like very much for that to be possible, but it cannot be built on the premise that I am less than I am. It cannot be built on management and control dressed up as care. That is not love. And I am old enough and I have loved enough real people to know the difference." Nobody spoke for a while after that. Brendan reached for his wine glass and found it empty and set it back down. I think, Kayla said finally, her voice careful as someone picking up something they're not sure is stable, that we may have made some mistakes. I looked at her. I think that's possible, I said. They left at 8:30. The hug Brendan gave me at the door was different from the one when he arrived. Smaller, tighter, the hug of a man who is recalculating something he thought he understood. I held it anyway. He was still my son. That was not a fact that changed with his behavior, even when his behavior was what it had been. Kayla said goodnight with a half-formed sentence that petered out before it became anything, and I let it go. And I watched them walk to their car and back out of my driveway. I closed the door, locked both locks. I stood in my entryway for a long moment. Then I walked to the kitchen, took the recorder out of my cardigan pocket, and pressed stop. I set it on the table next to my journal. The candles from the dining table were still going. I'd brought them to the kitchen counter while I cleaned up, and the light they threw was warm and a little unsteady, the way candlelight always is. As I called Martha. How did it go? She said before I could speak. I told them I knew about the note. A pause. How did they respond? Brendan went white. Kayla went quiet. I sat down. I didn't tell them about the forms. I didn't tell them about Douglas Farr, not by name. I told them I had an attorney, that I had updated documents, that I was keeping records. I wanted them to understand the situation without understanding exactly what the situation was. Smart, Martha said. Give them information without a map. Kayla said they may have made some mistakes. That was the most honest thing she said all night. Did you believe her? I thought about it honestly, about the way Kayla's hands had been in her lap and what her shoulders had done, and the way she'd looked at the candle rather than at me when I said the things that mattered. I believe she said what was useful to say in the moment, I said. Whether it becomes something real, I don't know yet. That's not tonight's question. Martha was quiet for a second. And Brendan? Brendan is more complicated. I looked at the candle on the counter. He's angry, and he's scared. And underneath both of those things, I think he's ashamed, but the shame isn't formed enough yet to do anything useful. It might, given time. I paused. Or it might just calcify into something worse. I don't know which. What do you need tonight? Nothing, I said. I'm all right. I just needed to tell someone. Then I'm glad you called. We talked for a few more minutes. Nothing strategic, just the ordinary conversation of two old friends at the end of a long day. And then I said goodnight and sat in my quiet kitchen alone. The recorder sat on the table in front of me. Inside it were 3 hours of audio that included, clearly and without ambiguity, Brendan stating that they had been consulting a family advisor specializing in aging parents, and Kayla beginning a sentence about account access that she had not been allowed to finish, and both of their silences in the moments after I mentioned the note. Douglas Farr would have what he needed. Patricia Steele had already flagged the accounts. My medical evaluation was scheduled for the following Thursday. I had made the appointment myself, I had been the one to call, and the fact of that initiative was itself a kind of documentation. And somewhere on the other side of whatever came next, I had a life I intended to keep. I called Harold in the morning. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the slight roughness of early morning, and I said, I wanted to tell you how dinner went, and he said, good or bad, and I said, somewhere in between, but closer to good. And he said, tell me. So I did. He listened all the way through, then he said, you told them you had the note. Yes. How'd that feel? I thought about it. It felt like putting something down that I'd been carrying wrong, like I'd been holding it tensed up, waiting, and saying it out loud, let me hold it differently. That makes sense, he said. I heard him move somewhere, the sound of a chair, a door. He was probably in his kitchen. We had, in the past 2 weeks, developed the tentative geography of each other's mornings without quite discussing it. Are you okay? He asked. Not are you sure, or are you really okay, or the particular brand of worried question that contains its own answer. Just the direct version, asked by someone who was prepared for whatever I said. I don't know yet, I told him. I think I will be. That's the right answer, he said. Outside my kitchen window, the morning was coming in gray and slow over the back garden. The tomato plants along the fence were about 6 inches tall now. They'd gone in late, I'd been distracted, but they were coming. They always came, given enough time and the right conditions, even when the start was harder than it should have been. I looked at them for a long moment. Then I opened my journal, wrote the date, and started the next page. There were things still to do: the medical evaluation, another meeting with FAR, more recordings, more documentation, more of the careful patient work of building something solid enough to stand on when they finally made their next move. Because I knew they would. Kayla wasn't a woman who stopped. Brendan wasn't a man who accepted a setback without looking for another way through. But I was ready for that now in a way I hadn't been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I was a woman washing a single coffee mug and hoping her son's voice on the phone meant what she wanted it to mean. Now I was a woman with a recorder and an attorney and a locked filing cabinet and a new deadbolt on the front door and a man who answered the phone on the third ring and asked her if she was okay and meant it. I wrote the date at the top of the page. I wrote, "They are not done. Neither am I." Then I put the pen down and went to make breakfast, and the morning light came through the window the way it always did, imperfect and ordinary and entirely mine. The medical evaluation was on a Thursday. Dr. Anita Reeves had been my primary care physician for 11 years, a straightforward, no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s who had the particular quality of listening to patients without looking at her watch while she did it. I had called her office and requested the cognitive assessment myself, and I had told her receptionist exactly why: that there was a possibility someone might try to use my medical history as part of a legal action, and that I wanted a current, professionally documented evaluation on record initiated by my own request. The receptionist had paused at that. It wasn't the usual reason people called to schedule appointments, and then said she'd pass the information along to Dr. Reeves directly. Dr. Reeves had called me back herself that same afternoon. "Evelyn," she said, "tell me what's going on." I told her. Not everything. Not the recordings or the specifics of the legal strategy Douglas Farr was building, but the essential shape of it. The train station, the forms in my filing cabinet, the pattern I had identified and what I believed it was designed to accomplish. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued about her. When I finished, she said, "How long have you been managing this alone?" "I have people helping me now," I said. "An attorney, an old friend, a neighbor." I paused. "But in the beginning, yes, alone." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll schedule the full battery. Not just the standard screening, the comprehensive evaluation. It takes about 2 hours. The results will be documented in your file with the date of your request and the clinical findings." Another pause. "This is a smart thing you're doing, Evelyn." "I've been told I'm losing my mind," I said. It seemed reasonable to prove otherwise. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not unkind, more the recognition of someone who had heard a great deal of human absurdity and had learned to find it faintly, grimly funny. "Thursday at 9, she said. I arrived 10 minutes early. The evaluation took 2 hours and 20 minutes. There were memory tests, pattern recognition, language processing, executive function assessments, the kind of comprehensive mapping that takes the measure of a mind from multiple angles. I had not studied for it, because you cannot study for this kind of test, and because I had nothing to hide, and that was exactly the point. I answered every question as I encountered it, honestly, at my own pace, without apology for the moments where I had to think before I answered. Because thinking before answering is not evidence of deterioration. It is evidence of care. When Dr. Reeves went through the results with me afterward, she was direct. "Your scores are consistent with a healthy cognitive profile for your age group," she said. "In several categories, so verbal memory, executive function, processing of multi-step information, you're scoring above average for your cohort." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "There is nothing in these results that would support a claim of cognitive incapacity, nothing that comes close." I let myself breathe. "I'd like a copy of the full report," I said. "Already printing," she said. I drove home from that appointment with the report in a manila envelope on the passenger seat and my hands steadier on the wheel than they had been in weeks. Not because I had ever genuinely doubted my own mind. I hadn't, not truly, even in the worst moments. But because doubt and fear are not always rational things, and I had spent a month living inside a situation specifically designed to make me feel like less than I was. Having a document that said, in clinical language, that I was exactly what I knew myself to be, that mattered more than I had expected it to. I called Douglas Farr from the driveway. "I have the evaluation report," I said. "Full battery, requested by me, dated today. Dr. Reeves said the scores are above average in several categories." "Good," he said, and I could hear him writing. "Bring it in when you come on Friday. That combined with the updated legal documents and the recordings gives us a strong defensive file. If they file anything, we're ready. If they don't, the documentation still serves you. It's a baseline on record that establishes your capacity as of this date." "And if they try to move on the accounts?" "I spoke with Patricia Steele's office yesterday," he said. "The flags are active. Any unusual access request, any attempt to present authorization documents, any third-party access query, gets manually reviewed and triggers a call to your cell. She was very clear about that." I sat in my car in my own driveway, in the warm June morning, and felt the particular satisfaction of a structure that has been built properly. Every piece in the right place, every gap covered, the foundation solid beneath the weight of what might come. "Thank you," I said, "for all of this." "Evelyn," Douglas said, and for the first time in our professional acquaintance, he let the formality drop slightly. "What you've done in the past 4 weeks, the documentation, the recordings, the proactive medical evaluation. Most people in your situation don't do any of that. Most people react. You prepared." A pause. "Whatever happens next, you gave yourself the best possible position." I thanked him again and went inside. I put the manila envelope in the filing cabinet, behind the new tab I had labeled in my own handwriting, "Defense File, Do Not Remove." Then I went and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and let myself feel, for a few quiet minutes, the specific relief of having done something right in a situation that had tried very hard to make doing anything right impossible. The call from Brendan came on a Monday, 18 days after the dinner. I had not heard from him in those 18 days. Not a text, not a voicemail, nothing. The silence had been its own communication. I knew what it meant, the way you know when an animal has gone quiet. Not because the danger has passed, but because it is deciding something. I had used the time. I had met with Douglas Farr twice. I had transferred 2 of my 3 accounts to a new configuration that required dual verification on any transaction above a certain threshold. I had also, with Douglas's guidance, drafted a letter to Brendan, not sent yet, held in reserve, that laid out, in plain language and without legal jargon, exactly what I knew, exactly what was in the defensive file, and exactly what would happen if he or Kayla attempted to access my finances, my property, or my legal standing through any mechanism I had not explicitly authorized. The letter was not a threat, it was information. The same thing I'd said at the dinner table, but formalized. Douglas had reviewed it and said it was appropriate, and that the timing of sending it would depend on what Brendan's next move looked like. When Brendan called that Monday, I almost didn't answer. Then I remembered the recorder, checked that it was running, confirmed the sound level, and picked up. "Mom." His voice was different. The calculation was still there, the way a habit never fully disappears, but underneath it was something ragged, like the surface of something that had been smooth for a long time and had recently been worked against. "Can we talk?" "We're talking," I said. "I mean in person. I'd like to come by." "When?" "Tomorrow. Just me." A pause. "Not Kayla, just me." That was interesting. I filed it away. "Tomorrow at 2, I said. "I'll be here." He came at 1:55. He was alone, as promised, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. The particular hollow quality around the eyes that Raymond used to call decision face. The look of a man who has been running scenarios in his head at 3 in the morning and has finally landed on something without being sure it's right. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd eaten alone every morning for 4 years. The same table where I'd written in my journal the night I came home from the train station. The same table where, 3 weeks ago, we had sat at a dinner that had changed something between us permanently. Brendan wrapped both hands around his mug the way I wrapped mine, and I noticed that the gesture, the inheritance of gesture, and felt the complicated weight of loving someone who has hurt you badly enough that you don't know yet if it can be repaired. He didn't speak right away. I let the silence be what it was. Finally, he said, I need to tell you some things. All right, I said. The train station. He set the mug down. That was Kayla's plan. I want to be honest about that. I went along with it. I'm not saying I didn't, but the idea, the note, all of that was her. He looked at the table. She had this theory that you were showing signs, forgetting things, getting confused. She said she'd noticed it over the past year. What signs? I asked. She said you'd called her by the wrong name once, at Christmas. I thought back to Christmas, the brief visit, 2 hours at most, in their house, with the television on in the background and Kayla moving in and out of the room. I don't remember doing that, I said. But even if I had, calling someone by the wrong name once is not a sign of anything. I know, he said. And the way he said it, not as a concession to me, but like someone acknowledging something they should have known before, was the first thing he'd said in weeks that felt entirely honest. I know that now. I think I knew it then too. But Kayla had a way of presenting things that made them seem more certain than they were, and He stopped, started again. I wanted to believe there was a problem, because if you needed help, then it made sense for us to be involved. In your finances, in your decisions. It made sense for Kayla to have access. And I wanted that access, Mom. I need you to know that I'm not pretending otherwise. The kitchen was very quiet. Why? I asked. I've never been wealthy, Brendan. There's the house, and there's the retirement accounts, and there's some savings. It's not the house, he said. The house has gone up. A lot. This neighborhood, you'd be surprised what it's worth now. He looked at me finally, directly, and his face had the specific expression of a person who has decided that honesty is the only thing left with any use in it. We have debt. Kayla's business. The expansion she did 2 years ago. It didn't go the way she projected. We're behind. We've been behind for a while. And I let myself look at what you have and think of it as something I could access, something that could fix our problem. I sat with that for a moment. It wasn't a surprise. Douglas Farr had suggested financial pressure as a likely motive when I'd first laid everything out for him. But hearing it from Brendan's mouth, in his voice, in my kitchen, was a different thing from having a lawyer speculate about it in an office. My son had looked at my home and seen a solution to his problem. You looked at what I've spent my life building, I said, and decided it was available to you. He flinched. Yes. Without asking me. Yes. While constructing a story that would let you take it legally, without my consent, by removing my right to make decisions about my own life. He was very still. Yes. I looked at him. At the boy I had raised, in this house, in these rooms, had taught to ride a bike in the driveway out front, had sat up with through fevers, had driven to every practice and every school play, and every disappointment and every small triumph that makes up a childhood. At the man he had become who had, with his wife, left me at a train station with a note and come into my home without permission and started building a legal framework to take my life out of my own hands. I don't know how to talk to you about love right now, I said, because what you've described isn't something I know how to put in the same room as love. But I want you to understand something. I leaned forward slightly. What you tried to do, it didn't work. Not because you were unlucky, because I am not the person you decided I was. I have been running this life competently and carefully for 72 years, and I will continue to do so. Brendan's eyes were wet. He didn't let it become crying. That had always been a thing he held back from, since childhood, some private stubbornness about tears, but his eyes were wet. I know, he said, and the forms that were placed in my filing cabinet, and the authorization documents with Kayla's name on them, and everything that was moved and searched in this house, that is documented. All of it. My attorney has copies of everything. He closed his eyes briefly. I thought you might, he said. I want you to tell Kayla, I said. I want her to understand the same thing you do right now, that I knew and that I was prepared, and that every move they plan to make has been anticipated and countered. I paused. I'm not taking legal action. Not yet. That depends on what happens next. But if there is any further attempt, any access attempt on my accounts, any legal filing, any approach to a doctor that I have not initiated, that decision changes. He nodded. He looked like a man sitting in the wreckage of something he'd helped build and was only now seeing clearly from the inside. "Is there anything left?" he asked. "Between us. Is there anything that can be—" He couldn't finish it. I looked at him for a long time. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's the most honest thing I can tell you." He left at 3:30. I stood on the porch and watched him go, and I didn't wave and he didn't look back. And the afternoon was warm, and the rose bush needed trimming, and the world was entirely ordinary in all the ways it always is, regardless of what has just happened inside it. The attempt on the accounts came 4 days later. I had almost let myself believe that Brendan's visit meant the plan had been abandoned, that his honesty, ragged and incomplete as it was, signaled an end to it. I had wanted to believe that because wanting it was human, and because the alternative, that the conversation had been its own strategy, a way of gauging what I knew and what I had, of buying time and adjusting the approach, was a thing I didn't want to assign to my own son. But Kayla was not Brendan, and Kayla had not come to my kitchen table. My phone rang at 11:14 on a Friday morning. Patricia Steele from Millhaven Savings. "Evelyn." Her voice was level, professional, with something underneath it that was not quite alarm but was adjacent to it. "I need to let you know that we've just had a visit. A woman presenting as your financial agent came in with documentation requesting access to your primary account. She had an authorization form, a copy of what appeared to be a power of attorney, and 2 forms of her own identification." My hand tightened on the phone. "Kayla," I said. "She didn't present ID under that name," Patricia said carefully. "She presented as a legal representative. The documentation looked credible at first pass. But we have the flags on your account, so it went to manual review immediately, and when my staff looked at the power of attorney against our records, the one on file here is the updated one your attorney submitted last month. The one she brought in was the old version, the one from 12 years ago." The old version. The one that had been in my filing cabinet. The one they had photographed or copied during the entry into my home, before I updated everything with Douglas Farr. They had tried to use the document that no longer existed. "She's still here?" I asked. "She left when my manager asked for time to verify," Patricia said. "Politely. She didn't make a scene. She said she'd come back with additional documentation, but I wanted you to know immediately." "Patricia." I took a breath. "Thank you. Please document everything, the time, what she presented, what your staff observed, everything." "Already done," she said. "And Evelyn, are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," I said. She walked into exactly what was waiting for her. I called Douglas Farr before I'd even set the phone down from Patricia. He was in a meeting. His assistant put me through anyway when I said it was urgent, which told me something about how Douglas had characterized my case to his staff. "They moved on the accounts," I said when he picked up. "This morning. Kayla went to Millhaven Savings with the old power of attorney, the pre-update version, and tried to access my primary account. The bank flagged it, went to manual review, identified the document as superseded. She left when they asked for time to verify." A pause. I could hear Douglas thinking. "Right," he said. "Okay, here's what happens now. I'm going to send a formal letter to any attorney they may have retained, if we can identify one, making clear that we are aware of the attempt and that we have the documentation from the bank. I'm also going to prepare a formal cease and desist regarding any further attempts to access your financial accounts, your property records, or your legal documents through any unauthorized means. And if they try again?" "If they try again after receiving that letter, we move from defense to action," he said. "What she did today, presenting a superseded legal document to a financial institution as though it were current, is not nothing, Evelyn. That sits in uncomfortable legal territory. They need to understand that." "Will she understand that?" "She will," he said, "when she gets the letter." I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat for a long moment in the Friday morning quiet of my own house. Outside the window, a cardinal landed on the tomato cage along the back fence and sat there briefly, brilliantly red against the green, and then was gone. They had walked in with an old piece of paper and found a wall. Everything I had spent the past 4 weeks building. The new documents, the bank flags, the legal file, the recordings, the medical evaluation, had held. The trap they had laid for me had become the structure that stopped them cold, and they had not even understood, walking into the bank that morning, that the ground had already shifted beneath their feet. I thought about Brendan sitting at my kitchen table 4 days ago, his hands around his coffee mug, his eyes wet with something he would not let become tears. I thought about Kayla walking out of the bank when the manager asked for time to verify. Politely, she'd left politely, because she was always polite, because the performance of correctness was its own kind of armor. And not knowing that the phone call to me had already been made, that the documentation was already being written down, that the letter was already being drafted in an office across town. I thought about a folded piece of white paper in a plastic sleeve in my filing cabinet. If she still has her mind, she'll find her way home. She had her mind. She had found her way home. And she had spent every day since making sure that home was still standing when they came for it. Douglas's letter went out the following Tuesday. Martha read it before it was sent and said it was thorough and appropriately measured, firm without being inflammatory, specific about what had occurred without overstating it, clear about the legal implications of any further attempt without making promises that couldn't be kept. It named the bank visit. It named the superseded document. It referenced the recordings from the dinner, not their content specifically, but their existence, and the fact that they had been made legally under single-party consent and were part of the file. It closed with a single paragraph that Douglas had written and that Martha said was exactly right. Mrs. Hart is a woman of full legal capacity and sound mind, as confirmed by a comprehensive cognitive evaluation conducted at her own initiative on June 12th by her physician of 11 years. She is not a woman who requires management, intervention, or the removal of her financial or personal autonomy by any party. Any further action inconsistent with this understanding will be met with the full available legal response. I read it twice when Douglas sent me a copy. Then I folded it, put it in my own file, and made myself a cup of Earl Grey and stood at the kitchen window looking at my garden. The tomatoes were coming in now, small green globes along the vines, the heirlooms that Raymond had always insisted on because he said they tasted like tomatoes were supposed to taste, and everything else was a compromise. I had staked them with his dowels and watered them through a difficult spring, and they were coming in. The phone rang that afternoon. Brendan. I answered. The recruiter was running. I got a copy of the letter, he said. His voice was flat, in the way voices go flat, when emotion has been compressed into something that doesn't have a name yet. I imagined you would, I said. She wasn't trying to... He stopped. She thought the paperwork was still valid. She thought, Brendan, I said it quietly. Don't. A long silence. Don't lie to me, I said. Not now. We are past the point where that does anything useful. He was quiet for long enough that I checked that the call was still connected. The debt is bad, he said finally. I didn't want you to know how bad. You could have told me, I said. That's the part I keep coming back to. You could have called me and said, Mom, we're in trouble, we need help. I am your mother. I have been your mother for 44 years. You could have called me. You would have wanted to know everything, he said. You would have had opinions. I would have been difficult, I said. Yes, I have opinions and I am not always easy. That is true. I looked out the window. But I also have resources and I love you and I would have tried. That is also true. And you chose this instead. He didn't answer that. I'm not going to give you money, I said. I want to be clear about that. Not because I don't love you, but because giving you money right now would not be an act of love. It would be an act of enabling, and I've done enough of that in my life to know the difference. I paused. But I'm willing to sit down with you without Kayla for now and talk about what you're dealing with, not to fix it for you, to help you figure out what can actually be done. Silence. Why? He asked, and it sounded genuine, not strategic, not angled toward anything, just the actual question. Why, after everything? Because you're my son, I said. That's the whole reason. It doesn't cancel what you did, but it doesn't cancel itself either. He cried then. Not in a dramatic way, but it wasn't a collapse, wasn't a flood of apology and grief. Just the quiet, private sound of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a long time and had finally set it down somewhere that wasn't the right place but was at least the ground. I let him. I did not comfort him because I was not in a place yet where I could do that and mean it. But I let him have the moment without rushing him through it, because that much I could still do. Come on Saturday, I said when it had passed. We'll talk. He said he would. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a while with the recorder still running, though there was nothing more to record, and I looked at my hands. The hands of a 72-year-old woman who had walked 18 miles of rural road alone, who had come home to a violated house, who had documented and planned and maneuvered with a steadiness that surprised even her. And I thought about what the past 4 weeks had taught me. Not about Brendan, not about Kayla, about myself. About what I was capable of when the situation required it. About the difference between being safe and being strong. Because I had been safe before all of this, in the careful, muted way of a woman who has outlived her primary person and turned her life down to a manageable volume. But I had not been strong in the full sense of it. I had been surviving, competently, one coffee mug and one chair and one plate at a time. This, all of this, had required me to be something more than surviving. And I had been. I was. Harold came over that evening. I didn't need an invitation anymore. That had resolved itself naturally over the past weeks, the way things resolve when two people find they are consistently useful to each other's days. He brought a bag of groceries because he said he was making dinner, and I had enough on my mind without worrying about feeding myself, which was both presumptuous and entirely correct. He made a simple pasta, nothing elaborate, the way he cooked generally, with the confidence of someone who has fed himself for years and found the work satisfying without needing to make it complicated. We ate at the kitchen table as the evening came in through the windows, and I told him about the bank, about the letter, about Brendan's call. He listened. He asked 2 or 3 questions. He said good, in the particular way he said it. Not triumphant, not performative, just the plain acknowledgement of something that had been done right. It's not over, I said. The debt therein that doesn't go away. And Kayla is not someone who accepts a closed door easily. Probably not, he agreed, but the structure holds. Everything I built in the past 4 weeks, it holds. I looked at my pasta. They came at me thinking I was a woman who could be managed, and I wasn't. I'm not. Harold was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way that had become familiar to me. His silences were never empty. They were just unhurried. You know what I think is the thing they got most wrong? He said. What? They thought aging made you smaller. He looked at me steadily. They didn't account for the fact that 72 years is a long time to learn how to fight. I looked back at him, this man I had known for less than 2 months, who had stopped on a rural road because a woman was walking alone and had not stopped showing up since. This man who installed deadbolts and brought groceries and answered the phone on the 3rd ring and asked if I was okay and meant it. No, I said. They didn't account for that at all. Outside, the June evening was warm and the roses needed trimming and the tomatoes were coming in along the fence. Inside, a meal had been made and the table was set for 2, and the house smelled like garlic and pasta, and something that was not grief, not exactly, but was close enough to ordinary life that I could feel the difference. The filing cabinet in the spare bedroom was locked. The new deadbolt was on the front door. The defense file was in its place. Every document, every recording, every piece of carefully gathered evidence sat waiting for whatever came next, as patient and ready as I had made myself over the past 4 weeks. I picked up my fork. Whatever was still coming, it would find me here, at this table, in this house, entirely myself, entirely in possession of everything that was mine. Brendan came on Saturday, as he said he would. He arrived alone, as he'd promised, at 2 in the afternoon, and I had not made anything elaborate. No pot roast, no set table, no performance of hospitality designed to hold space for something else. I made coffee and put out a plate of the shortbread I'd baked that morning because I needed something to do with my hands at 8 a.m., and baking was the thing I'd always turn to when my mind was working through something it hadn't finished yet. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen. I'm not entirely sure why I chose that, except that the kitchen had become, over the past 2 months, a room associated with documentation and evidence and the serious business of protecting myself. And this conversation needed to happen somewhere that didn't carry all of that weight. He looked better than he had on Monday. Not good. The sleeplessness was still there, and something around his mouth that I recognized as the residue of a difficult week, but better. More present. Like a man who has made a decision and feels the particular relief of no longer deciding. How's Kayla? I asked. Because I had to ask, and because whatever I felt about her, I was not going to pretend she didn't exist. He looked at his coffee. Angry, he said. At me, mostly. Which is Probably fair. He set the mug down. She feels like I threw her under the bus. By coming here. By what I told you on Monday. Did you? He was quiet for a moment. I told you the truth. That's not throwing someone under a bus. That's just telling the truth. He looked up. She knew that what we did was wrong. She knew it at the time. She'd made a calculation that the end justified it, and I let her make that calculation on my behalf, and that's on me. He paused. She's not a villain, Mom. She's a person who made very bad choices because she was scared and because she is someone who, when she gets scared, looks for control. I know that about her. I should have... He stopped. I should have been a better counterweight to that. I looked at my son. 44 years old. Tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. Sitting in my living room with his hands around a coffee mug the way I held mine, the way his father had held his. The gesture traveling down through the years like something in the blood. Tell me about the debt, I said. He did. It took about 40 minutes, and it was not a comfortable 40 minutes. There were numbers that made me close my eyes briefly, decisions that I had to work to listen to without the response that rose up in me, which was the particular frustration of a mother who has watched her child make an avoidable mistake and cannot say I told you so because she never actually knew, never had the chance to say anything, because she had been kept at the precise distance required to keep her from knowing. Kayla's business expansion had been aggressive. A second location opened before the first was truly stable, financed on credit, launched into a market that shifted within 18 months. Brendan had known it was risky. He had told her so, twice, and she had presented him with projections and confidence and the momentum of someone who believes that the difference between a plan that fails and one that succeeds is the willingness to commit fully. He had committed, they had both committed, and it had not worked. How far behind, I asked, when he'd laid it out. He told me the number. I nodded. That's manageable, I said. It's not good, but it's manageable. He looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't quite speak. I'm not going to pay it for you, I said. I want to be clear about that. Not because I don't have the means, but because that wouldn't actually help you. You need to work through this. You need to feel the shape of it and find your way out on your own terms. Because if I remove the consequence, you don't learn the thing. The consequence is trying to teach you. I looked at him steadily. But I know people. I have a financial advisor who has seen situations like this before and knows what restructuring looks like, what options exist. I can make an introduction. I can sit in the room if you want me there. What I won't do is hand you money and pretend the other thing didn't happen. He nodded. He looked like a man who had expected less and didn't quite know what to do with more. And Kayla, I said, I need her to understand, not from you, from me, that what happened between us is not over in the sense of being resolved. It is over in the sense of being finished. The plan is done. The attempt on the accounts is documented, and she knows that. But the conversation about what she did and what it cost, that's a conversation that has to happen at some point, when I'm ready for it, and when I believe she's capable of having it honestly. I paused. That's not a threat. It's just where things are. I'll tell her, he said. Tell her also, I said, and this was the harder part, the part I'd been sitting with since Monday, that I don't hate her. I want to be clear about that too. What she did was wrong in ways that go beyond the legal. She looked at a 72-year-old woman and saw a problem to be solved, an obstacle between her and what she needed. That is a moral failure, and I won't minimize it, but hate requires an investment of energy that I've decided to put somewhere else. Brendan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're a better person than I'd be. I'm not, I said honestly. I'm just a person who's run out of room for anything that doesn't serve the life I'm trying to build. He left at 4:30. We hugged at the door. Longer than Monday, less complicated than Saturday. 3 weeks ago at the dinner, something in between that didn't have a name yet, but felt like the beginning of a shape. He said he'd call about the financial advisor introduction. I said I'd be here. I watched him drive away, and then I went inside, and I sat in the living room for a while in the quiet, and I let myself feel all of it, the grief and the love and the anger and the something that was almost relief. Because I had been holding it managed and compartmentalized for 2 months, and there was nobody here now who needed me to be anything in particular, and the shortbread was on the plate and the coffee was going cold and the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in June, going gold and long across the floor. I let myself cry, finally. Not dramatically, Not the collapse I'd been bracing against since the train station. Just the quiet, private grief of a woman who has loved her child his whole life and found herself on the other side of something she would not have believed possible, and who has to grieve that specific loss, the loss of the version of the story where it didn't happen, before she can move forward into whatever comes next. I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I dried my face and ate 2 pieces of shortbread and called Harold. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Hard," I said, "but better than it could have." "You okay?" "I will be," I said. "I think I need a few days to just be a person for a while. Not a strategy, just a person." "That sounds exactly right," he said. The letter from Douglas Farr confirming the formal close of any active legal threat came 3 weeks later. Kayla had, through her own attorney, confirmed in writing that she was withdrawing any exploration of guardianship proceedings, and acknowledged that the power of attorney presented to Millhaven Savings had been superseded. The language was careful and legal and said very little in direct terms, but what it said in indirect terms was, "We know we lost, and we are putting that on paper so there is no ambiguity." I read it at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in early July. Then I filed it behind the tab marked Defense File. Do not remove, and closed the cabinet and locked it and put the key back on the hook inside the closet door. It was over. That specific battle, the one that had started with a phone call that sounded warmer than usual and ended with an attorney's letter and a flagged bank account and a recorder full of audio that now lived on a backed-up hard drive in Douglas Farr's office, was over. I stood in my spare bedroom for a long moment, just standing there, feeling what it was like to be on the other side of it. The room smelled like it always had, a little like old paper, a little like the cedar block I kept in the closet, a little like the particular stillness of a room that sees less daily use than the rest of the house. Raymond's reading glasses were still on the side table in the bedroom next door. His cardigan was still on the armchair. Some things I had not been ready to move, and I had stopped apologizing to myself for that. But I had been thinking lately about moving, not because I was afraid of the house or because it had been violated. It had been, and that was the thing I'd had to make peace with in pieces. The knowledge that strangers had moved through my rooms with intentions I found sickening. But I had made peace with it, mostly because making peace with difficult things is a skill you either develop or you drown, and I had been developing it my entire life. No, I had been thinking about moving because the house was 4 years of 1 mug and 1 plate and 1 chair, and I had been something smaller inside it than I was capable of being. And the events of the past 2 months had shown me, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly how much smaller. I wanted a different space for the next chapter, something that was chosen deliberately, not inherited by default from a grief that had become a habit. I called a realtor I trusted the following week. The house sold in 6 weeks. I had not expected it to be that fast, but the realtor had been right about the neighborhood. The value had gone up significantly, more than I had fully absorbed when Brendan mentioned it in my living room, and the sale generated enough that the next chapter was something I could approach with genuine freedom rather than just the illusion of it. I found the new place in a town called Carver's Mill, 40 minutes from Millhaven, small enough to feel human-scaled, but with enough going on that it didn't feel like retreat. A house on a quiet street with a backyard that got good morning light, and a kitchen with better counter space than anything I'd had in 30 years, and a room at the front that I immediately saw as an office, though I didn't have a clear idea yet of what kind of work it would hold. Harold drove me to see it the first time. He had strong opinions about the water pressure and the condition of the gutters and the age of the furnace, all of which were practical concerns. I was grateful someone was applying focused attention to while I walked from room to room, feeling whether the place had the quality I was looking for. Not charm, exactly, not beauty, though it had both of those in a modest way. I was looking for the feeling that this space had room in it, that I could be full-sized inside it. It had that. "The furnace is newer than it looks," Harold said, coming in from the basement. "I'm taking it," I said. He looked at me. "You haven't seen the upstairs bathroom." "I know," I said. "I'm still taking it." He smiled, that particular slow smile of his that started in his eyes before it reached anywhere else, and said, "All right." The closing was on a Thursday in late August. I signed my name 11 times and drove home to a house that had 26 years of my life in it, and began the work of deciding what I was taking with me. That process was not simple. It was not the efficient, organized, emotionally neutral activity that moving consultants suggest in magazines. It was 3 weeks of picking things up and setting them down and having unexpected responses to objects I had not thought about consciously in years. Raymond's reading glasses I took, his cardigan I took, the lacquered jewelry box I took, the kitchen table I took. It had been in this house for 16 years and I was not leaving it behind. The china. The photograph on the mantel of Raymond and me at the beach the summer before our youngest. The summer everything was still intact. The filing cabinet I took, obviously. What I left behind, the armchair. I had been keeping it because it was where Raymond used to read in the evenings, and because sitting near it had been, for 4 years, a way of being near him. But I understood, packing up that room, that I had been using the chair as a reason not to move, not just in the literal sense, but in the larger one. The grief had become a location. I had been living at it the way you live at an address, like it was the place I was supposed to be. I stood in front of the armchair on a September morning and said, out loud, to the empty room, I loved you. I'm going to keep loving you. And I'm going somewhere you can't come, and that has to be all right. Then I called the donation pickup and went to make coffee. Batek. Martha came to help me pack the kitchen on the second Saturday of September, because she had insisted, because she said she had not driven to my house for 30 years to stop now, and because she showed up with a box of good tape and a permanent marker and the organizational efficiency of someone who had spent her career dealing with the paperwork of other people's difficult life transitions. We packed and talked the way old friends pack and talk, discontinuously, in and around the work, picking up threads and setting them down and picking them up again without needing the threads to connect. How's Brendan? She asked, wrapping the good china in paper. We've talked 3 times since the Saturday meeting, I said. He's been in touch with my financial advisor. They have a restructuring plan in place for the debt. It's going to take a few years, but it's workable. I folded a dish towel. He's more honest with me now than he's been in a long time. Whether that holds, I don't know. But it's real right now. And Kayla? She sent me a letter, I said. By mail. Actual mail. Handwritten. I paused, setting a mixing bowl in the box. It was short. It didn't say everything that needs to be said, but it said some of it. She said she had made decisions she wasn't proud of, that she had treated my dignity as expendable. Those were her exact words, your dignity as expendable. I thought that was significant, that she could name it that specifically. Did you respond? Not yet, I said. I'm holding it. I'll know when I'm ready, and I'm not ready yet. I looked at the mixing bowl in the box. I may never be able to be fully comfortable with her. Some damage is like that. It changes the terrain permanently. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in a posture of war with my son's wife. That's not what I want the rest of my life to look like. Martha sealed the box and wrote kitchen, fragile, on the top. What do you want it to look like? It was the kind of question Martha asked. The direct one. The one most people dance around because the answer requires you to be specific about your own desires, which is surprisingly difficult for people who have spent decades orienting their lives around other people's needs. I want it to be mine, I said. Fully mine. Not in an isolated way. I don't mean I want to be alone, but I want to be the one deciding what it contains, who's in it, what I spend my energy on. I picked up another bowl. I've been waiting for things. For Brendan to come back, for the loneliness to lift, for something to change. And I stopped doing that sometime in the past 2 months. I stopped waiting and started building, and I want to keep doing that. Martha looked at me with the steady affection of someone who has known you long enough to see the change and understand its cost. You know, she said, when you called me that morning after the station, you sounded, she paused, finding the word, contained. Like you were holding everything very tightly, because if you loosened your grip at all, it would all come apart. That's accurate, I said. You don't sound like that now. No, I said. I don't feel like that now. She reached across the half-packed box and squeezed my hand once, briefly, the way people do when the gesture is enough. We kept packing. I moved into the house in Carver's Mill on a Saturday in late September with Harold's truck and Martha's organizational system and 2 men from a moving company who were efficient and careful with the furniture and who drank the coffee I made and ate the sandwiches I'd packed without any of us needing to be anything more than what we were. The kitchen table went in first because I insisted. The movers looked at each other briefly when I said that, but they did it without argument, and by noon it was positioned in the kitchen under the window that faced the backyard, and I stood looking at it in its new location and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a long time. The house did what I'd hoped it would do. It had room in it. The rooms didn't hold the specific silences of the Millhaven house. They held different silences, neutral ones, the silence of a space that hasn't been claimed yet and is waiting to take on the character of the person who lives in it. I found I liked that. The blankness of it. The possibility. Harold stayed to help assemble the bookshelf in the front room. The room I'd decided would be an office, though I still didn't know precisely for what. He was methodical about it, which I was grateful for because I was less methodical that afternoon than I would have liked to be. I kept being ambushed by small things, the way the afternoon light came through the front windows at an angle I hadn't expected, the sound of the neighborhood outside, quieter than Millhaven, different birds, the strange intimacy of being in an unfamiliar space with boxes everywhere that contained everything I owned. "You all right?" he asked, fitting a shelf bracket into place. "I'm feeling it," I said. "All of it, at once. I'll be fine." You don't have to be fine right now," he said. "The house isn't going anywhere." That was such a simple thing to say, and it landed with such unexpected accuracy that I had to look away and busy myself with a box for a moment. Harold Bennett was not a complicated man in the ways I had always been drawn to. Raymond had been complex in the way of someone who thought deeply about everything and carried it all visibly, which had been both the most compelling thing about him and sometimes the most exhausting. Harold was something different. He was solid in the way of a person who has done the interior work quietly, without making a production of it, and has arrived somewhere past the middle of his life at a kind of settled honesty that I found, the more I was around it, genuinely restful. We had not defined what we were to each other. I wasn't sure the definition mattered as much as the fact itself, that he was here, that he kept showing up, that the showing up was chosen and not obligatory, and felt different in my life from the way loneliness had felt for 4 years. I was not going to make the mistake of turning him into a replacement for anything. He was his own thing, and I was my own thing, and what existed between us was its own thing, and I intended to treat it with the respect of not asking it to be more than itself. "The bookshelf looks good," I said when he'd finished. He stood back and looked at it critically. "The third shelf is slightly off level. Nobody will notice." "I'll notice," he said. He fixed it. It took him 8 minutes. I unpacked books and handed them to him, and he arranged them by height because he didn't know my system, and I rearranged them by author when he wasn't looking. And when he noticed, he said, "I spent 8 minutes on that." And I said, "And I spent 30 years developing my filing system." And we were both laughing, and the room had already started to become mine. The program started as an accident, the way the best things sometimes do. 3 weeks after I moved to Carver's Mill, I was at a community center in town looking into a water aerobics class my doctor had mentioned, my knees still negotiating their relationship with gravity, when I overheard a conversation in the hallway between a woman about my age and a younger staff member. The older woman was trying to explain something about her bank account, about paperwork someone had filed on her behalf without her full understanding, about a daughter who had power of attorney and had been using it in ways that the woman was only beginning to understand were not what she had agreed to. She was frightened. Not dramatically. She was composed, the way women of a certain generation are trained to be composed even when they are frightened, the way I had been composed on a bench at an empty train station in May. But her hands were clasped in her lap at a particular angle, and her voice had the careful quality of someone choosing every word in a space where she was not certain she would be believed. The staff member was kind but young and clearly out of her depth. I sat down next to the woman. "My name is Evelyn Hart," I said. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I might understand some of what you're describing, and I know some people who can help." Her name was Rosemary. She was 68. Her daughter had convinced her to sign a power of attorney during an illness 2 years ago, and the scope of what had happened under that authorization had only recently become clear to her through a conversation with her bank. I gave her Douglas Farr's number. I sat with her for 40 minutes in the hallway of that community center while the water aerobics class I'd come to investigate happened without me, and I told her, not all of it, not my story in full, but the parts that were useful, that she was not imagining it, that the thing she was describing had a shape and a name, that there were legal mechanisms designed to address it, and that the most important thing she could do right now was to document what she knew before she did anything else. I drove home thinking about Rosemary for the rest of that day. And then I thought about the woman I'd spoken to at the pharmacy 2 months ago who had mentioned, almost in passing, that her son managed her finances now because it was just easier, and whose eyes had done something when she said just easier that I had not known, at the time, how to read. I read it now. And the neighbor's friend I'd met at Martha's birthday dinner last year, who had laughed about how her grandchildren were always on her phone, always showing her things, and sometimes things got moved around in her accounts, and she could never quite follow what had happened, and she laughed about it because laughing was easier than naming it. The women were everywhere. I sat at my new kitchen table, the old table, in the new kitchen, with my journal open in front of me, and I thought about what I had and what it was worth. I had Douglas Farr and a relationship with a bank manager who understood the patterns. I had Martha's 30 years of family law knowledge and her willingness to translate it into language that people who were frightened could absorb. I had my own experience, the documentation, the recordings, the legal strategy, the medical evaluation, all of it, not as a trauma to carry, but as a map that other people needed and didn't have. I had the thing they had tried to take from me, a mind that worked, that organized, that planned, that saw around corners. I called Martha that night. I want to do something, I said. A program. For women like me. Not therapy. Not a support group. Something practical. Legal literacy. Financial protection. What to do when someone in your family starts looking at you as a resource instead of a person. How to document. Who to call. What your rights actually are versus what people tell you they are. Martha was quiet for a moment. Where would you run it? The community center in Carver's Mill already has meeting rooms. I was there this week. I had the pen in my hand, writing as I talked. I'd want to partner with someone like Douglas, have him come in, or someone from his firm, for the legal component. I can do the personal component, the experiential part. Evelyn, Martha said slowly, do you understand how much work this is? Yes, I said, and you want to do it anyway. I need to do it, I said. That's different from wanting. I paused, looking at what I'd written. That woman at the community center, Rosemary, she was so relieved that someone believed her. That was the first thing she said to me after we'd talked for a few minutes. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. And I knew exactly what she meant, because I'd felt it too, in the beginning. That specific loneliness of something happening to you that people around you are either unwilling or unable to see. Martha didn't answer right away. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line, the way she breathed when she was thinking about something carefully. I'll help you, she said, with the structural stuff, nonprofit questions, liability, how to set it up so it has some durability. You shouldn't try to build it alone. I wasn't planning to, I said. I've learned my lesson about trying to do everything alone. She laughed. When did that happen? Somewhere on a rural road in May, I said, when a stranger stopped to ask if I needed help, and I said yes. The program had its first meeting in November, in a room at the Carver's Mill Community Center that held 14 chairs arranged in a loose circle. 9 women came to the first session. By the third session, there were 16. By the 6th, we had to request a larger room. I did not call it a support group. I called it a workshop. Your life, your terms. Legal and financial protection for women over 60. Because the women who needed it most were often the ones who wouldn't come to something that sounded like it was for people in trouble. Nobody thinks they're in trouble until they are, and by then they're often trying to manage the fear of it alone. Douglas Farr came to the second session and gave a 2-hour overview of legal mechanisms, power of attorney, guardianship, the difference between the two, the warning signs of each being misused, how to audit your own documents. He spoke without condescension and answered every question fully, and at the end a woman named Gloria, who had driven 40 minutes to be there, shook his hand with both of hers and said, I've been trying to understand that for 2 years and now I do. And Douglas looked faintly moved in the contained way of people who don't usually let that show at work. Patricia Steele came to the fourth session and talked about bank protocols, what you can ask your bank to put in place, what your rights are around account access, how to flag concerns before they become emergencies. She brought printed information and her business card and told everyone in the room to call her if they had questions, which I knew represented a significant extension of her professional role and which I was grateful for. Martha moderated 2 sessions on family dynamics and legal literacy. What language to use when you're dealing with family members who frame control as care, how to document a pattern over time, how to find an elder law attorney in your area, and what to ask at the first meeting. She was predictably exceptional at it. 30 years of family law distilled into language that was accessible and direct, and that several women told me afterward was the most clearly they had ever heard those things explained. And I led the other sessions myself. The personal ones. The ones where I talked about sitting on a bench at an empty train station reading a note in someone else's handwriting, and what I did next, and why I did it that way, and what I learned. I talked about the recorder in my cardigan pocket. I talked about writing everything down. I talked about the difference between the woman I was the morning of the phone call and the woman I was after. Not because I had become someone different in kind, but because I had learned something about who I had already been that I had been underusing. I was not a natural public speaker. I want to be clear about that. I stumbled sometimes. I forgot where I was going with a sentence and had to backtrack. I am 72 years old and I have a habit of tangents, and I do not have the polished cadence of someone who does this for a living. But the women in the room were not there for polish. They were there because something in their lives had the texture of what I was describing, and they needed to hear from someone who had been through it and come out on the other side with the practical shape of what that looked like, that I could give them. In the 7th session, a woman named Harriet, 75, impeccably dressed, a retired school teacher with a precision of speech that I admired, said during the open discussion portion, "I've been telling myself for 3 years that my son's involvement in my finances was my idea, that I offered, that it was a convenience." She paused. Sitting here, I understand that that's not entirely true. I understand that I was managed into that position by small steps, and that I chose to believe the story I was given because the alternative was accepting something very painful about my family. She looked around the room. I don't know yet what I'm going to do with that, but I needed to name it out loud, somewhere where someone else understood what I was naming. The room was quiet. "That's why we're here," I said. "That exact moment. That naming." She nodded. I looked around at the faces in that circle, women in their 60s and 70s and one in her 80s, each carrying something that had been invisible to the people around them, each having driven or been driven or caught the bus to a community center on a Tuesday evening because something had finally cracked open enough to let the light in. I thought about the bench at the empty station, the crow in the distance, the folded note. I thought about Harold's truck on a rural road and his voice saying, "I'm glad I came by when I did." I thought about Raymond's scarf in my canvas tote, the one I'd packed without quite knowing why, the loose thread at one end that I'd never let myself fix. I still had it. It lived on the hook by the front door of the house in Carver's Mill, and I touched it most mornings without thinking about it, the way you touch something that has become a part of the ordinary texture of your days. I had not stopped loving Raymond. I had not stopped loving Brendan, complicated and ongoing and unresolved as that love was. I had not stopped being, at my core, the same woman who had stood at a kitchen sink washing a single coffee mug and saved a voicemail from her distracted son because she needed it to mean more than it did. But I was not defined by the waiting anymore. I was not organized around an absence. I was organized around what I was building. Harold came to the 10th session. Not as a participant. He sat in the back, quiet, in the way he was always quiet, with a cup of coffee from the community center machine that he said was terrible, and kept drinking anyway. He had asked if he could come, and I had said yes without entirely knowing how I felt about it, which turned out to be fine. Afterward, when the room had cleared and I was stacking chairs with a volunteer from the center named Dee Dee, who had become, in 2 months, a person I genuinely liked, Harold came and stacked chairs too, and nobody said much, and it was entirely comfortable. We drove back to Carver's Mill together. I followed his truck in my car, the route familiar now, the turn onto my street something I navigated without thinking. He came in for an hour, and we had tea, and talked about the session, and about Dee Dee, and about a problem with his brother's fence that was apparently still not resolved, and then he went home, and I locked the new deadbolt on the front door of my new house and stood in my hallway in the quiet. The office at the front of the house had books in it now, and my desk from Mill Haven, and a corkboard on the wall where I'd pinned the schedule for the next 3 months of sessions, a list of referral contacts, and a note from Rosemary that she'd sent after our first conversation, which said, "I want you to know that I talked to the attorney. I know what I'm doing now. Thank you for sitting down." I stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at the light coming from under the office door. Then I thought about something I had written in my journal, in the early days after the train station, in the first raw hours of understanding what had been done to me. I had written, "They picked the wrong woman." Harold had said the same thing that first night at my kitchen table, with the particular plainness of a man who said what he meant. I had not known then how right that was. I had believed it, stubbornly, in the face of everything, but I had not yet seen what it looked like in practice. What it looked like was this: 16 women in a circle, and a corkboard full of names and numbers, and a legal file that had held when it needed to hold, and a house that was mine in ways that felt earned rather than inherited. What it looked like was this: a woman of 72 who had been left at an empty train station with a note designed to prove she was losing her mind, and who had gone home and picked up a pen and started writing. I'm not going to tell you that everything resolved cleanly. Life does not do that. Brendan and I were still in the early, careful stages of building something new from the wreckage of what the old thing had become. It was slow, and it required more patience than felt natural to me. And there were phone calls that went well and phone calls that didn't. And the question of Kayla was one I was still sitting with, still holding at arm's length until I understood it better. Douglas Farr's file was still in my cabinet. The recorder still lived in my cardigan pocket, because I had decided that being prepared was not the same as being paranoid, and the habit had become part of how I moved through the world. These were not perfect resolutions. They were human ones. The messy, incomplete, ongoing kind that don't wrap up because life doesn't wrap up. It just continues, and you continue inside it, with whatever you've managed to build and whoever you've managed to keep. What I had built was enough, more than enough. More than I would have imagined that morning in May when I stood at my kitchen sink watching the phone ring. I went into the office and sat at my desk, opened my journal to the current page, wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote, because it was true and because I wanted it on the record, I am 72 years old. I am not confused. I am not diminished. I am not a problem to be managed or an obstacle to be removed or an old woman in the process of becoming less than I was. I know what I am. I know what I'm worth. And I spent 30 years living at the address of a grief that was real, but that I let become a ceiling. I am done living at that address. The woman they tried to erase is the person at this desk, in this house, with this pen in her hand. And she is only just getting started. I closed the journal. Outside the window of my office, Carver's Mill was doing what small towns do in October, going gold and quiet, the evenings coming earlier, the air carrying the particular smell of autumn that I have loved my entire life. My tomatoes from the Millhaven garden were long finished. I hadn't managed to get a garden going this first season in the new house, had been too busy with everything else, but I had already planned what I was planting in the spring. Heirlooms, Raymond's varieties from the same seed catalog he'd used for 20 years, along the back fence where the morning light came in best. They were going to be excellent. I turned off the desk lamp and went to make tea, and the house held me the way a house holds a person who belongs in it. And outside the window, the October evening was going dark over the town, and somewhere across it, Harold Bennett was in his own kitchen, probably making something simple and sufficient for supper. And Martha Collins was in her stone colonial with her reading glasses and a glass of wine. And Rosemary knew the name of her attorney, and Harriet had named the thing she needed to name. And 16 women had sat in a circle and understood something they had not understood before, and the program had a meeting scheduled for next Tuesday, and the filing cabinet was locked, and the deadbolt was on the door. I was home. Not the home I had planned, not the home I would have chosen if choosing had been the available option in May, but the home I had made with my own hands from the wreckage of what they had tried to do to me. Mine. Entirely, irrevocably, completely mine, and that, after everything, was more than enough.